"There's no homestead," the agent said, and he said it like a man reading off a grocery list, not like a man ending a life she'd already started living in her head. Annalee Foster stood on the platform at Larkspur Junction with her trunk at her feet and the westbound train pulling away behind her in a long, indifferent shriek of steam, and she heard those 4 words land somewhere underneath her ribs. Not grief. She'd never met the man, couldn't grieve what she'd never had. Just a cold, falling elevator kind of fear, the kind that doesn't announce itself with tears, just with the sudden awareness of how much weight you'd put on a thing that had just been taken out from under you. She'd traveled 6 days by rail to marry a man named Joseph Tanner, a homesteader she'd exchanged 11 letters with over 4 months, a man who wrote in small, careful handwriting about wheat yields and a creek that ran along the back of his land and a porch he was building wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. She had told herself it didn't matter, that she didn't love him yet. She had told herself that a 160-acre claim and a man who wrote thoughtful letters was more security than she'd had in the 4 years, since her father's debts ate everything they owned. She had packed her whole life into one trunk and gotten on a train, believing she was walking towards something solid. And now there was no homestead. No Joseph Tanner standing at the platform with his hat in his hands, the way he'd promised in his last letter. Just this agent, squat, sweating, uncomfortable in the particular way men get when they're the messenger for someone else's failure, telling her that Joseph Tanner had died of a lung fever 3 weeks ago, and that the claim, unproved and now ownerless, had already reverted to the land office, and that whatever arrangement she'd had with him had died right alongside him. "You have people here?" the agent asked, not really asking, just performing the question so he could move on to the next item on his list. "No," Annalee said. "I don't have anyone here." She picked up her trunk before he could see the rest of her face do something she hadn't given it permission to do, and she walked into the town of Larkspur Junction, Montana Territory, in the spring of 1879. With $14 sewn into the hem of her traveling coat and absolutely nowhere to sleep that night. She had rehearsed fear the entire 6-day journey. She had sat with her forehead against the cold train window and gone through it the way a methodical person goes through a thing they know is coming. What if he's unkind? What if the cabin is smaller than the letters made it sound? What if 4 months of paper correspondence had let her build a man out of nothing but his handwriting and good intentions? She had been afraid, specifically, of marrying a stranger and discovering on the first night that she'd misjudged him completely. She had not once let herself imagine arriving to nothing at all. The fear she'd built, brick by careful brick, for 6 days had turned out to be the wrong fear entirely. The boarding house on the corner of Larkspur's one real street was run by a woman named Mrs. Odom, 60-some years old, built like a woman who'd carried other people's burdens long enough to develop opinions about weight distribution. She looked Annalee over, the trunk, the coat, the careful posture of someone holding herself together by main force, and said, "You're the Tanner girl." "I was supposed to be," Annalee said. Mrs. Odom made a sound that wasn't quite sympathy. $2 a week, suppers at 6. "Don't let the Garvey boys talk you into anything. They'll try." She held out a key like she was handing over a verdict. "Upstairs, second door." Annalee took the key. She climbed the stairs with her trunk banging against her shins and sat on the narrow bed and did arithmetic she'd been avoiding since the platform. $14. $2 a week for board. 7 weeks, if she ate carefully and found nothing else to spend on. 7 weeks to build an entire life in a town that hadn't been expecting her and had no particular reason to want her. When the knock came at supper, she startled so badly, she nearly knocked the lamp off the nightstand. There were 3 other boarders at the table that night. 2 railway surveyors passing through, tired and silent in the way of men who'd spent the day outdoors and had nothing left for conversation, and a woman near 40 named Birdie. No, not Birdie. That name belonged to someone else's story. Someone she'd never met, but whose shadow she was careful to step around. A woman named Opal Fenwick, who ran the dress shop 2 doors down and looked at Annalee the way women in small towns look at other women who've just had their whole plan collapse in public. "You're the one whose man died," Opal said. Not unkind. Just direct, the way people in small places tend to be when there's no use pretending the news hasn't traveled. "Annalee Foster," she said. "The arrangement isn't relevant anymore." Opal studied her for a moment. "There's work at the Mercantile if you can keep figures." Old man Pruitt, who runs it, is fair enough, long as you don't let him talk you into taking pay in store credit instead of coin. She paused. Eat something. You look like you haven't had a real meal since you got on that train. She hadn't. She ate carefully, deliberately, the way a person eats, when they've decided not to let their body's relief show on their face. That was when the door opened, and the room did the thing rooms do in small towns when someone of particular weight walks in. Not dramatic, just a slight reorientation, a collective small adjustment of attention. He was tall enough to duck the doorframe out of old habit rather than necessity. He wore a deputy's badge low on his vest, the kind of badge that had clearly been pinned there long enough to stop announcing itself. His face had been weathered by outdoor work rather than hard living, and he moved through the room like a man who'd spent years cataloging every detail in a space before he ever had to use that information. He stopped when he saw her. Half a second, controlled, but she caught it. The quick assessment, the trunk she hadn't yet carried up, the travel dust still on her cuffs. "Evening, Mrs. Odom," he said. "Sorry to come at supper." "Deputy Hale," Mrs. Odom said in the tone of a woman who'd been expecting exactly this. "Sit if you're hungry, won't stay." He looked at Annalee. "Miss Foster." She set down her fork. "Yes, Caleb." "No." That name was claimed too in the file she was being so careful not to touch. She corrected the thought before it could land anywhere visible on her face. "Nathaniel Reardon," he said, holding his hat in both hands. A deliberate gesture she registered the way she registered everything about him in that first minute. As information, filed for later use. "I heard you came in on the afternoon train expecting Joseph Tanner. I wanted you to know where the sheriff's office is, in case you need it. And that if anyone in this town gives you trouble, I'd like to hear about it directly." He said it plainly, without the practiced warmth of a man building towards something. "That's the whole of why I'm here." She had spent 4 years learning to read men who said protective things and meant something else entirely. Something that started with "you can depend on me" and ended with a bill she hadn't agreed to pay. She looked at Nathaniel Reardon and searched for the angle, the place where the kindness would eventually cost her. She didn't find one. That unsettled her more than finding one would have. "Thank you," she said carefully. He nodded, said good night to the table, and left. Opal watched the door close behind him and said, mild as anything, "He's been deputy here 3 years. 2 men who made themselves a problem to women in this town don't live here anymore." "Lost how?" Annalee asked. "Quietly," Opal said, and returned to her food. That night, Annalee lay on the boarding house bed and could not sleep. She thought about the home she'd lost in Ohio, about her father's debts and the cousin's house where she'd lived for 2 years on the understanding that her welcome had an expiration date. Nobody would state out loud. She thought about answering Joseph Tanner's advertisement in the first place. Not out of romance, but out of the particular calculus of a woman who is run out of soft landings and is choosing the least risky hard one available. She thought about a dead man she'd never met who had written, in his last letter, "I think you'll like the way the light comes through the kitchen window in the morning. I built the table myself." She felt the specific, hollow grief of an ending that had never gotten to be a beginning. She thought about Nathaniel Reardon, who had come to a stranger's supper table to tell her what the room looked like before anyone else could rearrange it around her. She told herself she didn't know anything real about him yet. She told herself to be careful with first impressions. She told herself this, and meant it, and then fell asleep. The first real sleep she'd had in 6 days. In the morning, she went to the mercantile. The owner, a heavy-set man with ink-stained fingers, looked at her hands and said, "Can you keep a ledger without making a mess of it?" "Yes," Annalee said. "Can you do sums faster than I can check them?" "Try me." He did. She could. He hired her on the spot, paid by the week, and told her plainly that if she ever shorted the till by even a nickel through carelessness, she'd be gone the same day. She agreed. She worked the counter for 6 hours and discovered, with some surprise, that the discipline her father's collapse had forced on her, the constant private arithmetic of survival, had made her fast and accurate in a way that was, for the first time in years, useful instead of merely necessary. She was walking home in the early evening, thinking about how 7 weeks might stretch further than she'd first calculated, when she nearly collided with a man standing outside the bank, well-dressed in the way that meant money rather than taste. With a thinner, sharper-faced man beside him she recognized from the train platform as the land agent. "Miss Foster," the land agent said. Good timing. This is Mr. Dunmore. He has some business that touches on the Tanner claim. The well-dressed man inclined his head. I understand Joseph Tanner spoke of you in his last weeks. He had certain intentions for the land that never got formalized. His smile didn't reach his eyes. There may be matters worth discussing, privately, at the bank, tomorrow. If there's anything relating to Joseph Tanner's claim that concerns me, Annalee said, I'd like the sheriff's sauce present for that conversation. Something shifted behind his smile. That's not necessary. I think it is, she said, and walked away before he could finish whatever sentence he'd been building toward. A skill she'd learned young, cutting men off before they reached the part where they expect you to be grateful. She didn't understand what intentions for the land meant, or why a man who'd never met her was suddenly so interested in her business. She knew only that the room was being rearranged around her exactly the way the deputy had warned it might be, and she didn't yet have enough information to stop it. She went to the sheriff's office. Nathaniel Reardon looked up from his desk with that same fast, complete reading of her face, and said, What happened? She told him, Dunmore, the bank, the word intentions hanging in the air like something still waiting to be claimed. He was quiet for a moment, then opened a drawer and pulled out a folder with the unhurried efficiency of a man who already knew exactly what was in it. Joseph Tanner filed a will with the county before he died, he said. He asked me to hold a copy myself, the week he got sick. He set a page on the desk between them. He left the claim, the proving rights, the cabin, all of it, to the woman he'd arranged to marry. By name. Annalee looked down and saw her own name in a dead man's careful, familiar handwriting. The floor seemed to tilt under her in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He left it to me, she said. Yes, Nathaniel said. He knew what you'd be walking into if it fell through. He wanted to make sure you landed somewhere instead of nowhere. Dunmore knew about this. Dunmore's wanted that creek frontage for 2 years. It's the only year-round water on this side of the valley. 3 other homesteads depend on access to it. Joseph wouldn't sell. The moment he died, Dunmore started working out how to get it anyway. She sat with the page in her hands, with the weight of it. Not just paper, but the thing the paper represented, the reason 2 men had arranged to intercept her on the street within a day of her arrival. They think I don't know what I'm holding, she said slowly. They think you're a woman who arrived with nothing and no one, Nathaniel said. They think that makes you manageable. I am scared, she said. That doesn't mean I'll let them use it. Something settled in his face, the same unreadable thing she'd find herself cataloging again and again over the following weeks. No, he said. I didn't think you would. He arranged for a property lawyer from the county seat, a careful, organized young man named Whitman Pryor, to come look at the will and confirm what Nathaniel already suspected, that it was valid, properly witnessed, unambiguous, and that Dunmore's claims of informal arrangements predating it would not hold up against a properly filed document naming a living beneficiary. Pryor's advice was to make no major decisions for 90 days, let the will's validity establish itself publicly, and only then decide what to do with the land. In the days that followed, the deputy walked her to the mercantile most mornings. Not in front, not behind, beside her. A small thing she noticed and didn't comment on. He sent a wire to Pryor the very night she told him about Dunmore, before she'd even asked. He stood across the street from the mercantile during her shifts, in a position where he could watch both directions, without seeming to watch anything at all. Opal caught her looking out the window once and said, without turning around, That man has stood outside more doors in this town than anyone gives him credit for. Don't mistake it for nothing. When Dunmore brought his own lawyer to a meeting at the hotel, a sharp, aggressive man named Foss, who slid a letter of intent across the table, dated 14 months before Joseph's death, claiming a right of first purchase. Young Pryor read it twice, set it down without inflection, and said simply that a will written 8 months after that letter, naming Annalee specifically and making no reference to any prior arrangement, was the only document that mattered in the eyes of the territorial court. Dunmore's face went hard and still. Foss put the letter away. They left without another word, and Annalee walked out of that hotel with her spine straighter than it had been since the train pulled into Larkspur Junction. You did that well, Nathaniel said on the walk back. Mr. Pryor did that. Pryor stated the law, Nathaniel said. You walked into the room and sat down instead of sending someone to do it for you. That's not the same thing. She found, over the following 2 weeks, that she trusted his silences as much as his words, that when he went quiet for 5 seconds, exactly 5, before answering something difficult, it meant he was working the problem rather than avoiding it. She found that he never once told her what to do with the land, only what the choices would cost. She found that when she told him, eventually, about her father, the debts, the slow public unraveling of a family's name, the particular shame of being 16 and watching strangers carry the furniture out of your house, he didn't flinch or soften his face into pity. He just said, "That's not something you did. That's something that happened to you," and let the silence after it sit there unfilled, exactly as long as she needed it to. She started reading to the children at the schoolhouse on Thursdays, an arrangement that began almost by accident when the regular teacher, Miss Aldous, broke her wrist hauling water, and the 11 children of Larkspur Junction had nowhere to be for 6 weeks. Annalee had taught for 2 years in Ohio before her father's collapse made the daily walk to a schoolhouse impossible. She found, standing in front of 11 faces ranging from 6 to 14, that she still knew exactly how to do this, that competence, once learned, doesn't disappear just because life interrupts it. It was Nathaniel who told her, 3 weeks in, that he'd been standing outside the schoolhouse most mornings while the children arrived, the same as he'd stood outside the mercantile. She found out from Opal first, the way these things tend to surface in small towns. "He thinks I don't know," Annalee said. "He knows you know," Opal said. "He just doesn't do it to be seen." She confronted him about it that evening at the sheriff's office, and he didn't deny it. "I didn't want it to feel like watching you," he said. "It's that I want to know you're all right, and standing somewhere I can see that is easier than not knowing." He stopped, started again, unusual for him. "I should have just told you." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I'm sorry," he said, simply, without building a defense around the apology. And she believed him the way you believe something you've gathered enough evidence to call fact, rather than hope. The night Dunmore made his last serious move, sending word through a man named Foss that he'd located, in Ohio, a distant cousin of her father's willing to claim some informal family obligation predating her travel west. In hopes of muddying the will's clean line of inheritance, Nathaniel was awake until past 2 in the morning, sending wires of his own, confirming with the county clerk in her home county that no such guardianship or obligation had ever been filed, that the claim was legally hollow before it ever reached a judge. He didn't wake her to tell her. He told her in the morning, over a second cup of coffee he clearly hadn't needed sleep to make, and when she asked why he hadn't come to find her at 2 in the morning, he said, "It was settled by then. You needed the sleep more than you needed to watch me settle it." She crossed the office without planning to, and put her palm against his jaw for just a moment, the way you touch something to confirm it's real, and felt him go entirely still under her hand. "Thank you," she said. His face did something she hadn't seen before, something more exposed than the careful watchfulness he usually wore. She filed that away too, with everything else she'd been quietly collecting about him since the night he'd stood in Mrs. Odom's doorway with his hat in his hands. He proposed on a Saturday at the edge of the Tanner claim, her claim now, filed and recorded in the territorial court under her own name, standing where the creek bent toward the cottonwoods. He didn't make a speech, he never had. "I want to build something here with you," he said. "Not because you need someone standing beside you, you've shown me plainly that you don't. Because I want to be the one standing there anyway, if you'll let me." "Yes," she said, and meant it the way she'd learned to mean things in Larkspur Junction, fully, without the old habit of holding part of herself in reserve, in case it had to be taken back. They married in the small church with a new bell, with Mrs. Odom and Opal, and the mercantile owner, and 11 schoolchildren in the front pews, and on their first night in the cabin he'd been quietly fixing up for weeks without telling her. The porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, a detail she hadn't asked about, and he hadn't explained. Until she understood, he'd built it because Joseph Tanner's letter had described one, and Nathaniel had decided, somewhere along the way, that the dead man's small unfinished kindness deserved finishing. He told her plainly that nothing would happen between them that night, or any night, except what she chose. "Your life is yours," he said. "I'm part of it because you let me be." That's the whole of it. She told him that night the precise shape of the fear she'd carried onto the train 6 weeks earlier. Not the abstract fear of a stranger, but the specific old fear of arriving somewhere as a transaction instead of a person. of being managed instead of chosen. He listened the way he always listened, completely, and when she finished, he said the thing she'd been waiting, without knowing it, her whole life, to hear someone mean. "You're not a transaction. You never were one. Not to me." She lay beside him afterward, in the cabin with the porch built wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, and thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train with $14 sewn into her hem and a fear she'd spent 6 days rehearsing for nothing. That woman would not have recognized this. That wasn't a sad thought. It was the best one she'd ever had. The letter from Dunmore's last lawyer arrived 8 months later, brittle with the particular desperation of a man running out of angles, asking her to sign something acknowledging a disputed right-of-way through her north pasture. She read it once, standing at her own kitchen table in the morning light Joseph Tanner had once described in a letter to a woman he never got to meet, and set it down without any of the old cold fear at all. "I'm not signing anything," she said, and Nathaniel, reading across the table from her, only nodded, because by then they both already knew it was true.